Welcome to our podcast. I'm Mary Abazia, and with me, of course, is Tom Spitali. And we are always keeping our ears and eyes open to see what's going on in the world and how does that, in some way serve as an analog for, especially for our B2B clients. And in this case, we just couldn't help but think about the headline on the Business Week article. The Business Week cover is the future of male birth control could be promising with pills and gels and implants, but can we get companies to buy in? And, it just gave us flashbacks to Viagra and the fact that, to unlock Viagra, it's you can be the most technically great company in the world, but if you don't think about the human side of it, it just isn't going to go. So Tom, I'll give a little more background on this, by the way. So one of the biggest developments now, because it's been around forever and there's all kinds of different male contraception, but now this pill that has it's a YCT 529, it blocks vitamin A that is dependent for protein to produce sperm. And the good thing about this is that it's hormone free and that it doesn't impact testosterone levels. So there's really no side effects to this. It's an interesting new opportunity. So with that, Tom, I'm opening it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the surface level, it looks like a slam dunk, right? But I bet Viagra looked easy. I mean, Viagra ended up being a slam dunk, but it took a little work, and that's why it reminds us of that situation. Let's just kind of look at this through a number of angles. Let's look at the very broad macro trends. One of the things that I think is probably not too hard to refute is the fact that men just generally in relationships are taking more responsibility for things than they have. I mean, when I think about what my father back in the 60s and 70s thought he was responsible in terms of contributing, just in general, contributing to the household and to what my son, who was married 5 years ago, thinks is his responsibility, there's just absolutely no comparison. And I noticed that a lot with his friends in that generation and just in general, men are stepping up more to take responsibility and share the load. And so why not with birth control, right? Um, Another thing that I think is really powerful about this is the lack of side effects. The side effect profile, at least, I mean, I'm talking more, I think, more towards the non-invasive forms, the pills and the gel on the shoulder. Very easy to take. Side effects seem to be minimal. Mary, you mentioned a few of them. That is definitely working in favor of this. And then if you look at sort of what we like to call indirect competitors, right? How else can you take care of this as a man? And you look at, do I want to take a pill? Or do I want to potentially just fix it permanently with a vasectomy? There's no comparison, in terms of just, all right, well, if I can take a pill for a while and make darn sure, before I get a vasectomy, I'm going to do it. So I think from all those standpoints, it'd be easy to say, let's just pour money into it as investors. As pharmaceutical companies, let's go crazy. But, I think more interesting to look at some of the cautionary parts of this, Mary. I mean, I have some ideas, but I'll throw that over to you so that we can talk about what could go wrong, because that's really important in any kind of market planning and trying to understand the landscape, the differentiation, the competitive set, the circumstances, the customer needs, all that. So what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think that the indirect competitors are also that women just take care of it.
Yeah.
It takes two to tango. So in this case, if I'm a male and I think, well, it's the female that is going to, have to carry the burden, quote unquote, then, and insurance companies, by the way, look at it that way. Right now, insurance companies may or may not cover it because it is considered a health concern or risk for women. But the only way that insurance companies will open it up, which we know is a big door for a lot of industries, is to consider it a couples issue, not just a female issue. So are there insurance companies that are going to be open-minded enough to look at it that way and give coverage for any of these treatments? Because at any point they're going to cost something. So what could go wrong is insurance companies don't buy in is probably one of the first.
And Mary,
Um,
would you lump that into the category of access, basically access strategy? Because, I think the other thing that goes along with access strategy is um, insurance companies don't generally fund lifestyle enhancers versus medical necessities. So I think that the companies that are marketing these male birth control solutions are going to need to really focus on the societal benefits of this, right? Why is this healthier? Why is it better medically for people to, be able to plan their families in the way and the pace that they want to? Those kinds of things, I think, are part of access strategy that are not a slam dunk and that need to be absolutely addressed and part of the strategy with these solutions, these drugs.
yeah, I like that. We found with Viagra specifically, where we think this is it has a lot of lessons from there, is that men were uncomfortable talking to their doctors, and doctors a lot of times didn't want to ask. So it was a complete lack of communication on both sides. So if you fast forward now to this, will that dialogue happen in the physician office? What will it take for some doctors and some physicians to feel comfortable? And that's where that segmentation comes in. The smart companies will do a segmentation, for the men, and they will find that maybe there's some that are what we might consider need-based, thinking about equal partnerships. It's us together doing this, or life planner, as you were saying. Let's plan when we want to have our pregnancies together. Those are segments of men, as opposed to an avoider that says, it's the woman's problem, she takes care of it. That's probably not a good target for people to go, a segment that you should target if you're a company trying to market this. So that's the male segmentation is important. And then just as important is the doctors. Some doctors, no matter
Yes.
how much evidence they have, they're just going to go, I don't have time to have a conversation with a male about this. So what do you think, Tom?
Oh, I agree. And I think the doctor segmentation is key here because I think it cuts across, what companies want to do is they want to segment, say, the general physician as a segment and the urologist as a segment. And I think what we found with Viagra is that some of the more open dialogue, a dialogue enhancing physicians cuts across that. So I think it's going to be really important to, find the segment or segments of doctors that cuts across general classifications who are going to be, the anchor, the ones that are going to be willing to open up this dialogue and talk about this in a very open way. I think as we think about segmentation, we think about that men and doctors. We also think about the stakeholder map. I think there is also to be considered at least a very important stakeholder on the map that Viagra probably thought about a little later than they thought they should have, or than they should have thought of them. And that is the opposite sex, right? Um, maybe there should be some experimentation with open this dialogue with the women. The women are um, way more used to having these kinds of dialogue with their physicians, OB-GYNs, or with their general physicians, and frankly, just more comfortable. So maybe, and that's where the doctors probably the dialogue about birth control is much more natural for the doctors, is in that environment as well. So I don't know if that's the key to unlocking it, but it's going to be something that they should probably look at very, very closely. You agree?
Well, I'm laughing because I love what you said, and I hadn't even thought about that angle. But you're right, that helped. I'm just thinking if I could ask my husband, obviously it's not an issue at this point. How comfortable would I have been to ask him? Hey, would you consider taking birth control. I just, it's an interesting thought that, it would be great to see how they do the research on that, because you're absolutely right. If you can look at that part of the dialogue and, how the segmentation of couples together um, are going to work through it, this is going to be very, very, very interesting to watch. So,
I agree. I
yeah.
there's one more aspect of this that I find super interesting. Um, there's a case study that's instructive in the right way to do this. Mary, our famous study about the AIDS drug, right? Being that this potential cure for AIDS that had, interesting chemistry but potentially harmful side effects. It was supposed to be a blockbuster and when it first came out. And the company that marketed this drug went wide. They marketed it to everybody, and it didn't gain nearly as much traction as especially their stockholders in the street expected. And it was a big, big, big deal until they segmented it down to really more of the early adopters, who's more open to this message. At the beginning, there were certain types of doctors that were more than willing to talk to their clients about a drug that was a potential cure but had some side effects. There was a certain profile, a certain segment of doctor that was willing to have that conversation, and that became like the anchor, the pilot launching pad for that particular drug that eventually gained traction with all the segments of doctors and patients and eventually became a very successful AIDS drug. But at first, they made the mistake of trying to spray it too broadly. I think that's a lesson that should be learned here.
Yeah, you're
What is just, don't get too greedy right away, because there are still going to be some safety concerns about this. I mean, really, is the side effect profile that benign? Maybe it is, but there are going to be people that are going to wait and they're going to want to see, and they're going to want to see some of the stats, of efficacy, right? So they're purporting 93%, which is okay. That's pretty high, but I mean, or is that going to be acceptable? But I'm just saying, I think that if they don't get too greedy too fast and have sort of a staged rollout where they focus on where they can win first and let the good mojo kind of carry over to the other segments over time, that might be a better way to get to blockbuster.
Yeah, I want to circle back to what you had brought up at the beginning was trends. And I was thinking, what does it take for this to become a worldwide, option? We think about the US, but if you think about, am I as a company going to invest in doing this? You need global, you need to be able to scale it. And the trends are going to be really important in different countries, because you'll have to, there's clusters of countries that politically they will find that this is not appropriate. Religion will pop into this. Religious beliefs will weigh in on if this is appropriate or not. So it's interesting, as you expand beyond just the U.S. and even the U.S., you're going to have pockets of issues too. How do you assess which countries are going to be more or less open to this? So I don't know. It's a real interesting category that's emerging. So.
I think ultimately it will succeed, and I think it'll be a big deal. I mean, some of the projections are pretty significant. Of course, billions of dollars are the upside to this, and I think eventually male birth control will get there if they learn. The marketers of the drugs themselves learn from what's happened before them. I think they will. Those lessons are out there now. They've been out there for a good while. So I'm going to predict success here, Mary.
Okay, I am, but I think it'll go through the trough of disillusion on the way to becoming successful. And I think that this case is so relevant to any company that is, looking at new categories, or, has something that they've run up against a wall and they don't know how to open up. They're technically great, but they're still not meeting the projections that they think are available. I would go out and start looking at segmentation of different stakeholders and see where you could unlock it. So,
Yep. Yep, we see
Anyway,
this
good
all the
luck.
time. We see this all the time, right? My final parting shot before we say goodbye is there's many people out there in different types of categories, not just pharmaceuticals, that have products and services that they're like, this should be the default. This should be a slam dunk, and it's not. Well, some of the things that we talked about here are probably the what's getting in the way and are the keys to unlocking it.
Good. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.